Dr. Irving Finkel is curator of Mesopotamian artefacts in the British Museum. He's one of the very few people who can read cuneiform as though it were the morning paper. He's regarded by many as one of the national treasures of the British Museum and the only one with a cult following. So, Irving Finkel, thank you for joining me today.
Well, Philip, I'm glad to see you. I'm glad to be back. Marvelous.
Thank you. Now, this is the second time that we've met,
Yes.
and the first time produced a lot of interest. It's my most popular video by far. There's 180,000 people so far have viewed that, which is a huge number of people, I would say.
Mm.
And what they point out to me is that there are lots of questions I should have asked you, which I didn't ask you. And
But
they've
that always happens in life, doesn't it?
it
If you have an
does, doesn't it?
altercation on the bus with somebody, when you've got off the bus, you suddenly remember what you should have said. It's the same sort of principle.
Exactly the same. So I've got a few questions here for myself,
Okay.
but I've also got quite a few questions from your extended fan club. And they really do appreciate your scholarly work and your teaching abilities. You ought to read it sometime, but it's just astonishing. Anyway, I'll split my questions up into two parts. I'm going to go for my own questions first, if I may.
Right. By all
And
means.
one which might I don't know if you find this easy or not, but if I was to ask you, what were the three most important artifacts in the British Museum that no visitor should miss if they go there, what would you pick out?
Well, the first one, I think, would have to be the Lewis chess pieces,
Oh,
because they're not in my department. They are from the mid-12th century. They were found in the 19th century, about 1820, off the coast of Scotland, off the Isle of Lewis, as far as we know. And they are spectacularly wonderful walrus ivory chessmen, carved with a great deal of authority and humour. And I've always thought they were marvelous. It's one of the strong reasons why I I should say, got into the British Museum at a relatively young age and have been here ever since. So they are spectacular because they are set out at a height where children can see them as well
mm,
as adults, which is important.
mm,
And the thing about them is that they have a very fixed gaze. The eyes are very well carved, and they have a fixed gaze looking at the visitor rather quizzically. So if you are in front of them, if you're a child, or you stoop down a bit, you look at these chess pieces, which are carved in human form, kings with beards and queens and bishops and so forth. You look at them face on, and you find yourself automatically drawn into some kind of, I don't know, involvement. You want to play chess with them, you want to be the winner on their side, and you also want to have a conversation with them. So they are the most appealing, tactile, if one could touch them. Of course, people can't, but they draw people in like anything. And I think this is an important matter because in museums in general, especially large museums, there's a lot to see. It's not always that a visitor will spontaneously feel drawn to an object and look at it twice and walk round it and think about it and go hum and ha. So this is a good kind of litmus paper. And the loose chess pieces, I would say, are one of the top things. Of course, it's all otherwise a matter of taste. But
mm.
I would have to say that everybody makes a beeline for the Rosetta Stone, the decipherment of hieroglyphs, because it's a very familiar thing, but actually it is a miraculous thing because you have this text in Greek put into hieratic, hieroglyphic, and so forth, and demotic script on the stone, which opened it for first decipherment, and that's one of the great achievements of scholars of antiquity, and it opened up Egypt in the most extraordinary way. They never looked back, and of course they have lots of inscriptions all over the place. So it started Egyptology when the great scholars who competed and who raced and achieved it together did it. So the Rosetta Stone is not to be missed. It's just the most fantastic thing. And I suppose if I had to choose the third thing, it would be everything else. It's a bit like, when people say, what gramophone records do you want to take? And then you have the last one is the entire output of Beethoven on 178 or some joke like that. But in a way, it's a bit invidious to pick things because The luxury of the museum is that you don't have to pay for it, which is still an important matter. You can wander large, led by your toes or your nose, and just look at things. And the fact that achievements of mankind, so to speak, are all together under one roof is a marvelous thing. It is a kind of, I would think we could be proud of the British Museum anyway, like the other main museums in the world, proud of them as national or international things. But also, if you had a couple of Martians who landed on the Great Court and got up the steps without being beaten up by the warders and went in the museum, they would see in one go a fantastic spread what the human race has achieved since the Paleolithic or before the.
But I would add to that one myself because I think I was always fascinated by one particular object in the British Museum because I used to watch an old film when I was a kid,
Yes.
and it was about the Portland Vase, and it was
Oh, yes.
Peter Finch, I think, was in it as he desired this object more than anything else, and eventually I got to see it in the British Museum, and like many others, I just sort of stood and looked at it for quite some time. So it's always had an attraction for me. Um,
You know, of course, the Portland vase has a very dramatic history.
yes, it was smashed up, wasn't
It
it?
was smashed by a lunatic, and then it was broken up by conservation and put back together. So it had a rather dramatic career, but they
Yeah.
did a beautiful job. The first restoration was a bit in a hurry and a bit crude, but the modern restoration is marvelous. It's a very interesting thing. Yes.
Yeah. Can I make it a bit more personal? Which artifacts in the British Museum, although you've said which are the most important for the general public to see, are there any particular artifacts which you have a personal attachment to, which may not be what the
Well,
public would think of?
I do. I mean, I have a personal attachment, insoluble, I would say, to the royal game of Ur, because this is this board game from the Sumerians. And I used to go to the museum, as we talked last time, from childhood onwards, and I was always very fascinated by that game because when they dug it up, it's a very beautiful thing. It's got 20 different squares, and they found the dice and the pieces. And yes, well, that's a horrible modern commercial version of the thing, but that's it. The real object is very beautiful. Yes, it's made of exotic stones and very beautifully crafted. But the thing was, it was found in a grave, and the archaeologists were very painstaking to bring everything out. So altogether, there are 4 or 5 of these boards from different royal graves, and dice and pieces. And of course, nobody really knew how to play, and I decided really quite early on in life that I wanted to work out how to play this game. So I had a go at it like everybody else, but then it turned out there was an inscription in the museum which was about it, although it was so difficult to understand that in a way it was worse than having nothing. But that board has had a great effect on my life because I've always been wrapped up in it. And when I was a school kid, there was a man called Robbie Bell who wrote a book. He was a plastic surgeon. He wrote a book about board games and how to make them and what fun it is, in the 1960s, or when people wrote that sort of book. And I had this book out of the library many times, and I went to see him once, and he showed me his collection, and it sort of set me interested in games for the rest of my life. And I went to see him. I was in America. I had a job in Chicago. I wrote to Robbie Bell, who's by then quite an old man. So when I get to the British Museum, I'm going to find an inscription one day that tells us how to play this game. And he wrote back, oh, well, it'll be nice, and let me know how it pans out. Well, in fact, I did. I found this tablet, which was written in the second. It was miles later than the board, which is about 2400 BC, but it was about the game, although it was much, much more complicated because it was at that time played by astronomers and philosophers, and they like things to be symbolic of the heavens, and there's all sorts of other stuff going on in it. So the simple game, which everybody reconstructed, and I had to go at too, the thing about it is because of this YouTube madness, when innocent people turn on their computer who have no idea what they're going to watch, and suddenly this thing comes on the screen, and then they start watching it, and that's that. The Royal Game of Words had a great deal of publicity from this point of view, and people all over the world play it. They make up electronic versions. They write to me with suggestions about how to play it. There's a guy at MIT who plays it with his students. They have an annual competition. He had the idea the pieces could go backwards. Then he had the idea the pieces could be stacked. And I met this guy. He was terrifyingly intelligent. And goodness me, I just started this rat, like you do on hunting a hare or something, and they're all over the world. So they play the Royal Game of Ur in some cafes in Baghdad as a result. So it's gone a complete circle of time. And I think that's marvelous. It's marvelous.
Yeah, I think it is indeed. And you are therefore key in getting that working because you translated it then, or you translated the difficult rules. And did,
Yes.
did you make any rules up yourself, or are they
Well, I
all?
tell you what, if you have a board like that and you've got two sides and the same number of pieces each, and you've got the numbers on the dice, and it's a race that you go around and it's a competition to get off the end. This is generically obvious. It can't really be anything else. So you can work out a perfectly good functional game like that without any details. And what happened was that the tablet was so complicated and so difficult that if I had a working scheme about the game on the basis of the archaeology, it became more possible to understand the cuneiform inscription than the other way round. So people would say this is a circular argument, and I know it is a bit of a circular argument, but the fact is that the game which has been pushed onto the world has been very successful, and
Yeah.
lots of people enjoy it. So I'm not too worried, and I'm going to have to write another article about this set of rules because I've got more out of it, more understanding, because it became symbolic of the planets moving through the heavens and
All
things
right.
ecliptic and I don't know what. Because in the 2nd century, there were these mathematicians from Greece there and people who speculated about the cosmos, and it all rubbed off. So what was started out as a pub game of great simplicity became, for these academics who literally lived in a kind of ivory tower in the sense that we think of it today, played the game on a very austere level with great deep symbolism. So I've got most of it, but not all of it yet.
Okay, well that's interesting. Is it the oldest game in the world as far as you know, or is there something?
No, I like to think it was, and of course it's helpful, but sadly, in a way, it isn't, because in the Neolithic period in the Middle East, in the countries of what are now Syria, Jordan, Israel, Turkey, and so forth, a whole span of contiguous modern Middle Eastern states, in the very earliest period of their archaeology, that's to say in the Neolithic, round about 8,000 BC, something like that, quite a long time ago, 10,000 years or more. In many of these sites, they had stone boards of a comparable type. So they were a slab of stone, prepared surface, with 2 rows of parallel holes, usually 5. And of course, everybody said, well, maybe they're this, maybe they're that. But in point of fact, I can't think there's any question, but they were, they were games, and how they worked, we have no idea because it's so remote and there's no evidence. But they surely were board games or game boards, because there are 1 or 2 sites where Neolithic, so to speak, villages or settlements are on a route where they have a crossroads that goes from one to the other, and but by one of these crossroads there was a stone with several of these boards, or probably the old men during the day when they had nothing better to do was sent there by their wives to go and play with their mates and get out from under their feet. We can't help but think it was something like that. So of course, that in the world of board games and game boards, if you have a modern thing with the rules and everything is transparent. But the problem with archaeology is you usually have the boards without the pieces, or vice versa. So there you have to use a high level of ingenuity. But the type of game with 2 rows of holes is something which is still alive in the world today. The general term, the generic term, is mancala or wari, played all over Africa and then disseminated from Africa over many, many parts of the world, where the game took root and is still played very successfully.
Is
So
that
this,
older? Is Mancala older than Royal Game of Air?
well, the trouble is we don't know how old mancala is. There's no evidence. There's some 18th century written evidence, 18th century AD, but beyond that, it's all shrouded in the mist of time. So we don't know when Mancala came into being. And of course, lots of people who are jealous of Mancala and want it to be the oldest game in the world say that these early boards are obviously Mancala. I don't personally think they were, but the principle is that we have, the important principle is that when man lives in a settled sort of place, it's say in the Neolithic, you have within society a shift where there is leisure, where you have not the 24-hour requirement to go following animals and shooting them with your bow and arrow, or anything of that kind. And you have people living together, people have responsibilities, some people are in charge, then you get walls round it, and then you get the modern kind of developments that we all know so well. But when settlement first comes, you have probably in society leisure for the first time, because animals eat or feed or hunt all day long. They never let up because they're always on the hunt. At least most species are. Certainly, most species are, and presumably Homo sapiens or the Neanderthals or whatever came first were much the same. But when you have a settlement, I mean, it's very hot also. So you have grandmothers looking after children while the adults do the serious work and all that sort of pattern. And games take very firm root in that sort of environment because of course, in antiquity, it's a silly, stupid thing to say, but in antiquity, there wasn't very much else to do. There were no newspapers, books, television, and all those sort of modern distractions. And people went to bed when it was dark, and they got up early and they worked their fingers to the bone and everything. But there weren't many activities which gave the sort of pleasure, the relaxed pleasure or competitive pleasure that board games provide. And the thing is that when they do first appear in the world, they are almost found in all societies sooner or later. So it's very hard for an anthropologist to come up with an island in a big ocean and say, well, they never played any board games here, you're wrong. But in fact, it is a very human thing to turn to fiddling about with bits and pieces and producing a kind of friendly form of competitiveness, because if you compete with people when you get angry, then people get hurt. But if you compete on a more intellectual process, or a race to seize the first off, and all those sorts of things, it has a function in society more than just entertainment. Sometimes it mitigates all sorts of things, and it's a very interesting matter. And of course, different scholars who work on this have different theories about it. But my own view is that games, when they appear at a stage when nobody would argue about them being games, for sure were primarily for entertainment. I think that's their function.
Yeah, I think that's a fair enough comment. Can I shift gear a little bit and ask about something else that runs parallel with Mesopotamia? And
Yes.
there's the one historical document that many people look at and read today, which does run roughly around about that time, of course, is the Old Testament and the Bible.
Yes.
I wondered, does the Mesopotamian cuneiform accounts give any information about the Bible, and does the Bible give any information about the Mesopotamian societies, and how accurate or inaccurate do you consider biblical documents in comparison with the ones that you're studying personally?
Well, that's a very important question. In the first instance, there are different sorts of connections between the two corpora of written evidence. So, for example, the Assyrian kings sometimes went to war in what used to be called Palestine, well, whatever you call it, in the Near East, in the cities of Israel and Judah, and against Egypt and so forth. They had their reasons for warfare and battles and sieges and accounts. And we have from successive Assyrian kings detailed accounts of their military campaigns. They always won. It's one of those things that you used to get in the newspaper, like, the Americans went to war and a couple of chaps had a bit of plaster on their knee when they got home, and then 25,000 other people died in the process, that sort of thing. Well, the Assyrians were a bit like that. They don't dwell on the downside. But where we have, for example, Assyrian military annals that overlap with the period of the Bible, and sometimes mention the Bible by heart, like Hezekiah occurs in one of these Syrian kings. They laid siege to Jerusalem, like it's described in the Bible, and Hezekiah is then named in the cuneiform inscription. Where you have parallels, I think it's fair to say that there's never really anything which is where a skeptic could say, you see, I told you, it's all wrong, it's all made up, it doesn't fit. On the whole, it sounds a bit feeble how to put this fairly, but on the whole, it fits remarkably well. They overlap, they dovetail, and you don't find things which are glaringly in contradiction to what people used to call Holy Writ, or vice versa. Because, in the Bible, like in the Book of Kings, you get a description of a certain king. And the chronicler who wrote the Hebrew text was very keen to decide whether they were good or bad. And if they didn't marry idolatrous princesses from another country, and they didn't build temples for wicked idolatrous gods like all around them, they were good kings. And some of the kings are accounted for as good or bad in the Hebrew text in a very shorthand fashion. They, like that, they built the town hall and the swimming pool, and that's that. And then it says in the Hebrew text, and the rest of the deeds of this monarch, are they not recorded in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah and what they got up to? So in the Bible, at the end of a description of a king, there is a kind of footnote. For more details, see this famous composition about the kings, which must have existed on scrolls in Hebrew and part of the chancery of the kings of Israel and Judah, and kept up to date, which the biblical author quoted from. And it's that process of chronicling and depending on literary resources, which characterizes the similar material in cuneiform and Babylon in the Bible. So this is one area. Now another area where there's a kind of toing and froing is, for example, in the field of what you can call mythology or whatever you want to call it, because we know that the flood story started in Mesopotamia. We have descriptions of the flood from the 2nd millennium BC with great destruction and the building of a boat to rescue life, male and female, and a kind of Babylonian.
The Epic of Gilgamesh, is that
yes.
right?
Yeah. Well, indeed. Well, the Epic of Gilgamesh text that we have is written in the 7th century, but there's evidence from 1,000 years older from Mesopotamia, from earlier tablets of the same narrative. So the thing is, when you look at this narrative, as was discovered in the 1870s by George Smith, that the story in the Gilgamesh epic, which then was the only one really known, constituted the most staggering parallel to the description in Genesis of the waters and the boat and the animals and a guy called Utnapishtim, who was their local version of Noah. And to the point that when it stopped raining and the waters began to go down, the releasing of the birds, which we know from the book of Genesis, also in Mesopotamia as well. So when you look at these things under a friendly microscope, which is the best way of doing it, there's no question whatsoever but that the story of the flood in the Bible derives from a Babylonian forerunner. There's no question of it.
And Noah existed then?
That I wouldn't say, but they had I'd be glad if one were to meet Noah one of these days, because there are lots of things I would like to ask. But leaving that aside, the idea that man was vulnerable to destruction by water, and that sometimes it happens and sometimes they escape by the skin of their teeth, and they do it by means of a boat, which is not such an absurdity, was a deep-seated thing in ancient Mesopotamia, where floods were a common problem. They never were in Jerusalem. And the story was lifted to provide a structural process in order to teach about good and evil, or sin, in the beginning of the Bible. Because in the Mesopotamian discussion of why this destruction happened, why the world was obliterated by the gods, or nearly obliterated, it was because it said the human beings were so noisy, that woke the gods up after lunch. So they thought they'd wipe them all out, and they'd invent something more peaceful, more hardworking. So when the Judeans, as well as I see it, when the Judeans started their 70 years in Babylon after the destruction of Jerusalem, they were taken from Jerusalem to live in Babylon. It was in that environment that this story became familiar to them, and the intellectuals, the chroniclers, and the people who mustered the people together and kept their existence safe decided this was a very good story for teaching the power of the Almighty, as they put it. And um, uh, in the biblical sense, in the Hebrew sense, the whole idea was it was punishment for sin. It was a moral issue, and they were let off at the last minute, begrudgingly, by a rather vengeful God. So, whereas the Mesopotamian thing was nothing to do with good and evil behavior, what appealed to them with their particularly sharp reception to this kind of matter, this principle, it was an ideal teaching thing that, by the skin of our teeth we escaped, that God relented, but it was all because of sin and being wicked. And the other thing I would say about this matter, about some bloke being plucked out of his bed and said, you've got to build this boat, room for all the species you can think of, male and female, get on with it. You've only got a few weeks or a few days or whatever. And tick, tick, tick goes the clock. Well, the thing is, I can't imagine anyone could ever add up the number of Hollywood films in which somebody has 24 hours to save the world. And in the clever technique of the modern world, they often have a clock in the corner in case you don't get the point, where it goes tick, 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 like that. And, it's somebody from outer space, or God knows what it is. And one bloke has got the big syringe to rescue mankind, and the clock is ticking. So, in a way, the device which the Babylonians had, which the Judeans, philosophers, couldn't resist because it was so powerful, is never relinquished its hold, even though, of course, the people who write these films never think of it in those terms. But from a formal point of view, they're very similar. And it's because of this last minute relenting. And also, the thing about the rainbow, which, if you remember in the Genesis story, was to promise it would never happen again. Well, the Babylonians also had a rainbow in their narrative about the flood. So there's no question but the two Hebrew and Aramaic sources came from the Babylonian tradition, and there was a bridge whereby
one. Sure, the Babylonian one came first and the Bible didn't come first.
Certainly not, because we don't know exactly about the biblical thing, but it would be very, very remarkable to find any example of a biblical source before 1000 BC. Very unlikely. I mean, people normally say it's about the 7th century and so forth that the text became the text that we know, something like that. Certainly not as old as it. But this flood thing I was talking about, is around 1800 BC. So it's a clear millennium before there were any Judeans or anybody thinking about the strange religion which they invented. And the remarkable thing is, if you look at it, as I always do from the outside, that they had a religion where nobody saw their God, and their God wasn't married, and they didn't do anything like all the other gods all around them, Egyptian and Babylonian and Phoenician and Greek. There were lots and lots of gods, and some of them were married, some of them were adulterous. They had lots of children, lots of servants. And so the gods were like us in their social structure. And the thing that crystallized into what became Judaism, and then after it, Christianity and Islam, the same central idea of a monotheistic God, that wasn't someone you could see in the temple or talk to, or had any idea what their taste in movies might be, or anything like that. It was all an abstract. And the abstraction had such a grip that it's still alive in the world despite everything. It's rather remarkable, I think.
Right. And does that same idea apply to, there's another link that I'm at least aware of, which is the Code of Hammurabi and the
Yes,
Laws of Moses. Would you say there's a similar link there?
it's possible. Of course, when the Code of Hammurabi was first discovered, everybody made this point. But I think there's not really a close textual relationship between them. There's the principle of codifying instruction, but it would be a very artificial thing to say that these 6 laws here are the same as in the biblical Hebrew. It doesn't work so closely as it does with the flood narrative, which of course is literature. And the other thing with literature is you have the oral strength, which before writing can run forever and ever and ever. Lots of people know lots of things by heart before they learn to read and write. Then they forget the ability to do it. So you have the oral strength and then the written strength acting together, which is a very powerful force.
Right. Let me move on, if I may,
Sure.
to I've hugged all the time with my own questions so far, and I say you do have a large fan base which asks a rather wide range of questions. So, I mean, if you find any of these not suitable, just pass on. We'll move on to another question. But the first one is, have you ever been asked to play the role of Santa Claus?
Yes.
And have you ever done that?
Well, there are the two things that have happened to me. When it's about December the 12th, whenever we walk down the pavement, 2 or 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds always point at me and say Santa Claus. Lots of lorry drivers wind
Many
down
of
the
your fans
window.
do that too, I'm afraid, here.
Yeah. But the thing is this, I decided what to do about it, because sometimes mothers say, "Oh, don't be silly, come with me," or "Don't disturb the gentleman," or something. And I said, "No, that's fine. I have to ask you a question. Tell me something. Have you been a good boy this year or not?" And he goes white, and and the mother trying desperately to think of something good that he did all year to redress the balance. So sometimes I do that. So that's one thing. And actually, most people are very friendly and it's easier to make them laugh. But sometimes lorry drivers wind down the window and say something highly impertinent and that kind of thing. So I usually have a good riposte ready. But the other thing, once I had a letter, I was much gratified from somebody, I don't know who it was. They had a company where they had Father Christmases, which would appear in stores at the right moment in the right clothing. And was I interested? And I said I wasn't.
Oh,
So I don't know whether I'd have got through. I mean, Lord knows what the competition would have been like, but I didn't really think I would go for it. But now I rather regret it, because I think it might have been rather diverting and rather interesting, but it hasn't come back since. And
you never
so,
know, you might get another letter. Who knows?
yeah.
The second question is kind of a reproof from me, really, because I didn't ask you this question precisely or clearly enough. And
Right.
people want to know the answer to it, if there is an answer, that is.
Mhm.
Because the title of the last video was the oldest language in the world and what it says.
Right.
And do we actually know what the oldest inscription that we can translate that we know of? Do we know what the very oldest one, the
Yes.
first one that were actually does say?
Well, all we can do, don't forget this is an archaeological matter.
Yes.
So the earliest writing we have is the beginning writing that ended up being cuneiform to write Sumerian language. So the very, very earliest inscriptions we have, which are very pictographic and very abstract, may or may not be in the Sumerian language. But when we get a little bit like 200 years on, there are grammatical features that appear. So we know that the language is Sumerian. So Sumerian is, we must have talked about it last time, but what's important about it is we can say at the moment it's the oldest language we know of, but we cannot say it was the oldest language in the world originally, because I'm sure that the Neanderthals had language before Homo sapiens. The way they lived and the complicated lives they lived and the burial rituals and all this, they weren't silent. And I don't believe that all that went on was grunts. And this is a complicated thing about how language might have evolved. But between the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens at the beginning and the Sumerians, there's an unimaginable length of millennia. And we can be sure that the minute um, uh, language started, you would have a situation which is parallel to the modern world, because in the modern world, most of the languages we know form families of related languages. For example, French, Spanish, Italian, Latin, they're all cousins, and if you know one, you can see in the others bits you recognize and so forth. And this applies to some big groups, Slavonic languages and Semitic languages and or Altaic languages, and I don't know what, Hamitic languages. This is a phenomenon of language. So once the thing runs in the world, you have a family tree and things spread and they evolve like everything else does. So what we have with Sumerian is the last, rather, it's the first example we have of a language which must in its time been part of a large family of Sumerian type languages. It must have been, because all languages are. So history comes in with this big duster across the blackboard and captures Sumerian before it went extinct, which it would have done without cuneiform. And it's the last example of what was probably hundreds of thousands of years of different languages going right back and right back and right back. And I don't think that languages started off with grunts and then whistles and squeaks. I think that the extraordinary human brain evolved with language, and language evolved with the brain, and it was a kind of mutual thing. So that when people realized that sounds attracted attention, and when they realized that a particular sound, people recognized it and it became a name, and then they knew about names, and they knew about me and you. When you've got nouns and me and you've got language, and it's a matter of evolution and development. And so Sumerian is an unimaginable length of time after that kind of level. And there must have been, like in Russia, in all the way to India, all the way everywhere, there must have been, wherever there were outcrops of the human species, big families of languages which, unless something remarkable happens or archaeology makes a remarkable discovery, are probably lost forever. And Sumerian is quite different from the other languages of the Middle East that we know so well, which are all Semitic, basically, at least in antiquity. Arabic and Hebrew and all those sorts of tongues. Sumerian has nothing in common with them. It has nothing in common with Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit and the Indo-European languages. It's on its own. And when they go to university, which I hope all of your watchers will do to learn Sumerian, when you do learn Sumerian, you find it very difficult to believe that there's hardly anything in it which you recognize comfortably as being a kind of languagey type thing. Because if you've never done any Semitic, if you do a bit of Arabic with a sensible teacher, and you can see that the verbs, there's a root, and sometimes it gets more complicated, and the T is for the feminine. You put something at the beginning and something at the end, and you can see that the words, even if you've never done anything, are a human invention. They are basically familiar, and you could imagine that you could learn it. But with Sumerian, it's a whole different matter. It's much, much more alien, and you have a root in the middle, like a nut, and you put things on one end and things on the other, and you have to undo it all to get the meaning. And it's quite strange. And one of the other phenomenon about it is that the writing doesn't absolutely fit Sumerian, because there's some suggestion that it had in the language more than one kind of G, like in some of the languages like Turkish and Chinese, you have ngs and different types of ngs. In Sumerian, there were probably 2 or 3 of those, which are often not distinguished in the writing system, and other things like that, which might mean that the cuneiform, as it evolved into a finished sort of thing, was a bit of a crocrusty in bed, and it didn't really fit everything which it was supposed to do. However, this is a matter for further inquiry. So it's not totally bizarre Sumerian. And if you go to university and you have a very gifted Sherlock Holmes kind of teacher like I did, he was very strict, I probably told you last time, wagged a finger like that, and you had to learn everything. And
he used to beat you with a stick.
Actually, he had a stick leaning against the wall, but he never actually used it. But he had a much more acerbic tone of voice and a highly refined sense of sarcasm, which made a stick redundant.
So I have to pin you down on this, though.
Yes.
Is there, this is much more prosaic, but is there an oldest tablet or oldest inscription within the British Museum, which you can say, this is the oldest bit of writing we've got anywhere? And what does it say?
Okay, that's a very fair and very unfair question. So the thing is, we know that the writing started off as pictures. We know that. And in a site called Uruk in southern Iraq, they made a very spectacular discovery of a whole slew of very early inscriptions on clay tablets, and they could distinguish that there were phases. So there's one they call Uruk. And then there's Uruk 4 and Uruk 4a and Uruk 4b, for example, which means that when you have an inscription of Uruk, what they call Uruk 4b, the modern scholars, you can see that there is a kind of change or development of in a certain way between one and the other. So if you go back to the beginning where they're very simple, there are two problems about answering your question properly. One is the very earliest inscriptions we have are either short or we don't know what all the early signs are. This is one problem. And the second thing is we don't know how old they are, because this great find of things which were near the beginning were found as what archaeologists called fill. So that if you were doing a building and there was a cellar or something and you had to fill it in order to level off to build on top of it, these tablets had been dumped from somewhere else and they were out of archaeological context. So by inference, people say that the earliest inscriptions, working back and using what evidence we have, that the earliest things we have are about 3,500 BC. But I would bet you any money you like that there were things like that a long time before, which we just don't have. So we can see, looking analytically at the earliest evidence, that it bespeaks already a conception and an evolution and development up to the point when we start getting them. So it could be a very, very, very long time. And often with the very earliest inscriptions, we can see that they are god names. So we can see that they had a pantheon of gods for certain. And we can soon see verbs which mean, as it were, giving things in, giving things out, and you can see that there are wages, and gradually meaning comes out. But you see, the thing in archaeology, you can never ever say that something is the first of anything. All you can say it's the earliest we know of, and this applies very extremely in the case of language, I'm sorry to say. And we have some jolly marvelous things in the BM of early date. They're on exhibition, but there are no translations because nobody can read them properly.
Fair enough. Okay. Quite a few people in comments have disputed the fact that cuneiform is the oldest language. Some people have suggested Sanskrit is older. Some people have said, what about China and the Far East, or the ancient Hindu Valley where some writings have yet to be translated?
Okay, well, that's all fair, but we know that people in Mesopotamia were making marks on tablets of clay by 3,500 BC. Well, in the other places that you mentioned, there is early writing, but I think all the early writing in China is before 2000 BC. So the oracle bones, for example, where they had a sheep scapula, where you put the early Chinese characters inscribed on the scapula, then you have a hot poker and apply it, and the cracks that run between the signs give a meaning. So I think it's true that the oldest Chinese inscriptions are oracle bones, these oracle bones, and they are around about 1800 BC, something like that. So of course you don't invent writing to write on sheep's scapulae and then apply a hot poker as the first thing that you use it for. So again, with those earliest inscriptions, there's a history, a long history before. And I suppose, I mean, of course, the question, you have to answer the question more carefully, because cuneiform is not a language, it's a writing system. So the Sumerian language and the Babylonian language are written in cuneiform. So Sanskrit is a language and Chinese is a language. And the first written language in China, I think, is about 1800 BC, call it 2000, something like that. And Sanskrit is also can't be shown to have existed at a very early date, and I don't know how early, but it's certainly nothing like the antiquity in Egypt. In Mesopotamia, the only, so to speak, rival for very early development would be Egypt, where the hieroglyphic system, which evolved, grew out of earlier stages, of which some have similarly been recovered, but not all of them. And the question is, when you have very early stuff like Mesopotamia and Egypt, which are not very far away, and you have writing in ancient Iran, which is not very far away, some people think that all these cultures operated in a vacuum independent of the others, and they did what they did, and other people think that they had an easy flow of information, and that if you have a writing system in one, the others go home and they think, well, we can do that. And the Egyptians thought, well, I think birds and snakes and things are much more interesting than those silly spiky things they do, so we'll make up a beautiful writing system. And in fact, the way Egyptian writing and Babylonian writing function is not so dissimilar. The writing looks like nothing to do with it, but the system of the writing, how things are spelled and so forth, is comparable. So if you poke into this, you end up with this situation that some people think that writing was invented one day, one afternoon by one genius, and it went all over the world. And other people think that the circumstances which led to the development of writing, which is always a response to need, you couldn't have it if it wasn't necessary, that the same sorts of things that occurred within societies, and that writing in China came into being because they needed it, and the Egyptians, they needed it, and so forth. So it's an insuperable difficulty. But my own feeling is I don't believe in dissemination from one central point. And the thing is, actually, when you read books about the beginning of all this, there's a lot of very precious, oh, how miraculous, oh, how wonderful, how clever human beings are. But actually, the idea that you can make a squiggle meaning a sound is not so deep. It's not so deep. And if you think to yourself that, you know, if you, I don't know, you draw a sheep and it sounds like ba, so you think if you want to write bar, you draw a sheep, that kind of idea. Once you have it once, you can spend a long weekend with a pile of paper and a biro and invent a whole load of writing in one go. And anybody can do that. Anybody can do that. And there's another feature about it which takes the mystique out of the development of writing to me, is that the Mesopotamians, the Sumerians, they did little pictures first of ideas and later with the sounds. And the little pictures they do are what people pompously used to call pars pro toto. So in other words, if you draw a pigeon, you just draw a pigeon head and everybody knows it's a pigeon. So a lot of the very early pictographic signs are what children do when they're about 3. And this is a rather interesting thing to me, because also the Sumerians like to make puns, so that you can have a word that means one thing and it means another, and has more than one pronunciation, and or the sound can have more than one meaning. So there are lots of puns, and children, when they start writing and start speaking, often make things up like that as well. So it seems to me that it's a Homo sapiens thing. That's all it is. It's a manifestation of the creative essence of the human mind, that in response to stimuli and in response to the necessity to plan ahead and to communicate, all sorts of things are developed, including writing. And there's no reason why it should be limited to one place or one culture, but it's a human thing.
Fair enough. What about the mathematical side? This is another question from a fan. Did Sumerians have a zero?
No.
What was mathematics like?
They didn't have a zero. They had they at the very outset, it was very complicated, but it soon leveled out that they used a sexagesimal system.
Yeah.
So at the very beginning, there was a sexagesimal system for certain things and a decimal system for other things. And somebody must have thought, this is stupid. And although most people have 10 digits and the decimal thing is within their reach, in fact, mathematically, I understand, although I'm backward to the point of falling over in anything to do with mathematics, is that 60 is a more fruitful base to work with for calculations and big numbers than 10. That may be, but it soon solidified into a sexagesimal system. And they had a kind of place setting in that if you list things in a column, you put things where they belong. So they had a kind of conception of place, but they didn't have a sense of zero. I think that was from India. But the thing is, this sexagesimal system lent itself beautifully to cuneiform, because if you have a single wedge, this is the number 1 and the number 60. So depending on context, you have to judge. So a single upright wedge is 1 or 60, and they had a diagonal wedge, which was 10. So if you do 1 diagonal and 3 verticals, that's 13, and so forth. It's very quite straightforward. And so they use this sexagesimal system forever. And the interesting thing about it from our own point of view, as so to speak, what did we get from these buggers, is that all their mathematics, astronomy, and other matters were couched in sexagesimal system, which means that when the Greeks went to Babylon, attracted by their astronomical observations, which were very famous, the Chaldean astronomers, and their ancient literature, and their this, that, and the other, certain hardy people got on the Greyhound bus and went from Athens to Babylon to the university, so to speak, to find out, because the Greeks had a propensity for scientific, I mean, this is a simple way of looking at it, but it's basically true that the Greeks had an aptitude for distillation of principle and scientific clarity, but they didn't have any data. And the Babylonians had data about astronomical observations which went back centuries and centuries. And there was a kind of college in Babylon where they had all these astronomical records with the first visibility of Mercury and the last visibility all through the year and the eclipse dates and all manner of things, very, very complicated, because they understood a great deal about how the heavens work. And the Greeks must have fallen over themselves in their hurry to transpose this stuff into Greek and take it home. But when they took it home, what happened was that everything that they had was in 60s. And that is why we have 60 seconds and 60 minutes and 360 degrees in a circle, because so much of that knowledge was enshrined in that format that it just persisted. So I was going to say, any humble watch that you might have on your wrist, of course, A, nobody has a watch any longer, and B, if they do, it's digital, which ruins everything. But if you have one of those old ones that went round with a big hand and a little hand, that was a sexagesimal system.
Yeah, so they're quite advanced in that.
Very.
I've got a technical question, which I don't understand, but it's sent in by Lindsay Hayes.
Right.
And I think Lindsay's a girl. I don't know, I might be wrong in that, but he or she says the labyrinth motif, which apparently appears all around the world in South America and in China and different places, is not present in Mesopotamia. And she wonders if you have any comment on that, because she seems to think that this labyrinth motif has something to do with exorcism.
Okay. Interesting matter. Well, for one thing, you have what she refers to as a labyrinth motif, which is presumably a drawing of what is a labyrinth, which has a significance beyond the obvious.
Yes.
If it's a motif, but the motif is contingent upon the existence of a real labyrinth. And in Crete, of course, they had these things, but in Mesopotamia, I can say that in about 1700 BC, we have a large number of school tablets from more than one city, and some are very elementary and some are very sophisticated, and so to speak, graduate students of the school who got beyond counting, mensuration, writing names, writing all this. They knew all that stuff backwards and all the vocabulary. Some of them were going to be architects when they grew up, so to speak, because the king had to have architects to build nice palaces for the queen and the princesses, and they needed architects for all manner of things. They built lots of temples and walls and everything, and they had to know about load bearing and the strengths of the architecture and how many bricks you need to do this and how many for that and all that stuff. So a high level of training in school involved architectural matters. And among those tablets, there are some very detailed drawings of the plan of a building. So lots of the buildings had rooms round a courtyard, and on these tablets, which are about that long, there's the linear design with gaps where the doors were between the rooms, so much so that an architect could take this into the field and build from it because it was so carefully done. So that is the aspiration of the teaching system, and those are the sorts of things we find. But side by side with the plans of that kind, there are tablets that have labyrinths on. So if you have a tablet about that big, I don't know, about say 6 inches by 4, something of the kind, like a bar of chocolate, there are perhaps 24 specimens known where the flat surface of the clay is divided up with the stylus, the tip of the stylus, which they used to do the writing, into a frightfully complicated thing. Frightfully complicated. And the ones I've seen, they never made a mistake. So if you imagine doing that on a piece of clay and trying to get the parallel lines, and then they turn a corner, and it's a beautiful piece of calligraphy.
Of course, you never saw the ones they threw away.
Well, that is true. That is an interesting philosophical point, and I take it very seriously. But nevertheless, I think you'd have to be a great master of the genre to produce any that were flawless, because they're very complicated. And when you see them, you want to get your pencil and see if you can get the way to the middle. So that is certainly a labyrinth in principle. So I don't think anybody's found a labyrinth in the ground in Mesopotamia. But I think I would share with Lindsay the idea that that there's a fascination with the conception of a labyrinth. And in some cultures, in some places, perhaps they were actually built, like sometimes made of hedges in 18th century France, when you get lost in the hedges and you go round and round and round. And sometimes they perhaps took on some symbolism, for example, the complexity of life, that you start at one end and how you're going to get to the other. And you can see why it might have an allure as a motif, a symbolic motif, and at the same time, a reality. So it wouldn't surprise me if somebody wanted to write a book, which nobody would do anymore, saying the labyrinth among the human species. They probably find a huge amount of evidence. I mean, in the 19th century, that would have made a good fat 3-volume work, the history of the labyrinth. So I think it's both a symbolic thing and a real thing, depending on the culture.
Some people took issue with your comments last time about burial objects. You spoke
Ah,
about
yes.
objects, and you gave the impression, or at least to them, that that burial objects meant or implied a belief in the afterlife.
Yes.
And a lot of people said, well, that can't be so because, you know, I buried my husband 2 years ago and I put his golf clubs in with him because he always used them. And there were many reasons why people might be buried with artifacts which don't signify at all that they believe in an afterlife. What do you say to that?
Well, what I say to that is this, that people who bury golf clubs with their late husband, I should say, that's not the normal praxis. Most people go to their graves in Christian communities and certainly Jewish communities, and I imagine Islamic communities. When they go, they're buried, and they may have a prayer book with them, or may have something like that, but they're not usually given things that they like to do during their life, or things of this kind. So I think it's a different thing nowadays, and I don't mean to sort of retract from what I said, because in archaeology, graves always have grave goods as a kind of principle. And even when people are very poor, there are things in there. And it may be honoris causa, it may be respect, it may be things that people favored in their life, but the general archaeological principle is that everybody was buried with things, and they're very often vessels of food and tools. And I mean, Tutankhamun
Yeah, classic.
is the classic case, and Tutankhamun certainly believed in the world to come. And I think extrapolating back is a general rule of thumb, in my opinion, that you can take for granted that they thought that something happened to what was left of the person afterwards. Now, I know not everyone's going to agree with that, and it's easier to say, well, look at this case, look at that case. I was making a kind of generalization, which I stick to, although I'm fairly sure that if we went to a conference of real archaeologists who really dig things up, they'd all storm the stage in protest. But nevertheless, I still maintain that this is implied if you put things in a grave, especially if they're things that you want, costly or they were desirable or things like that, that it wasn't tantamount to Alf loved his darts and he ought to have his dartboard. It's more than that because it's one of the things that human beings, so to speak, do, big or little.
Okay. I mean, it's always puzzled me that when someone unearths a little figurine of a cat from Egypt or somewhere like that, they
Mm.
always say, oh, this represents the cat god. And I've always thought to myself, well, why wasn't it just a child's plaything or a token on a board or something?
I'm
How do you know it was
entirely with you.
God?
I'm entirely with you. This is the trouble, that there is a kind of prejudice among many archaeologists to um, assume that an object is a child's toy. And I don't know why it is, but it's the last thing that they think of. It's either a votive deposit, or it's a ritual object, or it's a miniature thing from a temple, or it's a this, or it's a that. Whereas when you look at terracottas, for example, which are cheap, little donkeys with wheels and everything, they're the sort of thing that dads made for their kids and they pull them along in the dust. And they are definitely, definitely toys. They are not symbolic carts given in the front of the altar to remind for the gods, remember the poor farmers and all that. No, I don't believe it. So I think everybody has toys. All cultures have toys. Children have toys. They have nothing else to do but to play with toys. So I would think the default position with small things is that they were for children. And of course, you can say you have a little offering table with beautiful miniature vessels on found in a tomb. Maybe that's something different, or in a temple, that's some. But small things are for children. I mean, half the population are children. This is the other thing. People talk about them as if they're another species, but they're part, and everybody lived together with grandmothers and sometimes sheep in the front room. I don't know how they lived in the pub, but everybody lived together, and the small children looked after the baby children and the next children and all that, and they had to do things, and that's how it is. And if you go to villages all over the world, that's how it is.
Yeah.
I'm with you that cats are cats and bastets in the temple, and little
Well,
cats are
one
toys.
of one of the things I learned from our discussion last time, I think, was that there's very little difference between human beings back in 3500 BC and human beings today, other than
That's my conviction.
of course, but in terms of character, personality, human problems, we all seem to be much the same.
I think so. Frailties and the capacity to believe things which are mutually contradictory depending on what mood you're in and all those sorts of things. Absolutely generic to the species, I would say.
Yeah. Some people were fascinated by your description of the waiting room for souls.
Oh, yes.
And I think they were looking for more information on that, or whether there were any other ideas like that from Mesopotamia, which you could elaborate on.
Well, the general perception among Assyriologists is that the description of the netherworld, which is exceptionally gloomy in Mesopotamia, dust and clay and dark and no nice drinking water, the most gloomy place in the world was where you went when you died. But this is a literary conception, and it's nothing to do with reality, because you can see when people bury things, they buried things that they thought they like life today, that it will be the same as life today, only a bit different. And the poetic description of the underworld is frightful. And the reason I think that it was a waiting room is I don't believe that that could ever have been the whole story, because it's such a ghastly thing to look forward to. And when ghosts escape from the netherworld and come up, I would have thought if I was a Babylonian, I wouldn't blame them. I mean, I wouldn't stay down there for 5 minutes. It was horrible. So that is the situation. And then I can't remember whether did we talk about this evidence for the life and death, and that the souls. You see, the thing is, the passage in this poetry is that the souls are locked in by there's 7 gates that you go through, locked gates all the way down to the netherworld, and everybody thought that these gates were to keep them locked in. But I don't think it's true. I think it was to control the ones that were allowed out when they were needed, because there was a sort of reciprocal balance where a person had to die for a new baby to be born. This, I think, is the deep-seated um, uh, psychological or religious, philosophical, whatever you call it, conception that the human material, the stuff of mankind, was finite, and that it had to be harnessed and protected, and that all the souls in the netherworld, rid of their bodies with just the human essence floating about in this gloom, and then one would be let out the gates, so to speak, when a new baby was coming, so that they would. It's not reincarnation; it's pouring material from test tube to test tube, more like that.
Yeah,
I think.
interesting. We're coming to the end of our time, I'm afraid, Irving,
You
because
just got warmed up. What's the matter with you?
well, I've got time if you've got. I just don't want to tire you out or keep going. But I've got about three more questions, if that's all right.
Fine,
Can we
fine.
manage that? Um, one of them was um, a controversial question. So
Right.
you may want to skip this or not, I don't know. But should the British Museum return the Elgin marbles? What's your personal view?
Well, I speak here personally, as you say. Um, I have 2 points to make. One is I think that to have the materials of the world displayed together under one roof with such a long heritage of appreciation of it is a desirable thing when there are so few such institutions in the world where things are safe, where people can see anything they want to. This is one thing. Um, so uh, I believe that very strongly. And the second thing is that a more complicated point, if it was decided, and I don't know who would decide it, and I sincerely hope this doesn't happen, if it were decided that the marbles should be returned to Athens, that we should surrender ownership of them, which I don't think that will ever happen. But if that did happen, the trouble is that everything else in the museum would then fall into the same position and
Exactly.
all go out through the front door because everyone would say, well, these are our marbles. How, they may
Well,
not look like much to you, but they're out, we can't live without them. We can't sleep. We can't eat. This is our heritage. And, all that stuff. And probably they want the Lewis chess pieces back in
I was
Scotland.
going to say, you'd at least be left with the Lewis chess pieces, I'd have thought, but but
We
maybe
can't
not.
be sure. We can't be sure. So this is my idea, and I always think it's a desirable matter that a hand-picked posse of experienced curators should be trained in the use of Kalashnikovs, so that if anything ever goes wrong, we go out on the portico and we fan out, and then we cut them down.
Well, that would be one way of keeping hold of them, I suppose.
I think so. Yes.
You've sparked a real interest in people who say that they want to learn cuneiform. And
Right.
the question is, how do people go about it? If you wanted today, as a young person, to decide you wanted to maybe learn cuneiform, off your own bat, maybe, because you're not going to do it at school, how would you go about doing it? I know you've got a book here, which I bought the last time I was in the British Museum, but
Ah,
this
well,
is
that's
not
just a
really a
picture book.
textbook, is it? It's an
No.
explanatory book.
It's about the writing and what it looks like and what we find written in it and how it works. So that's a different thing. So there's a guy called Martin Worthington who teaches at Trinity College Dublin, and he wrote I think it was called Teach Yourself Babylonian because that old system of Teach Yourself books still exists, and they approached him, and he wrote an absolutely first-rate introductory grammar of Babylonian in this series, but it's not like a little yellow book like they used to be. It's a proper book. And the thing is, he's a very able teacher, and he designed a system of teaching the grammar step by step, so you don't jump onto the next one until you've got the first one clear, and there are exercises, and it will be ideal to use in a classroom, say at a university. But also, if you had someone who was attracted by the idea and thought they might dip into it and see if they did like it, then Worthington's book is very friendly. It's not off-putting or intimidating. It's a really very, very good piece of work. So I would unhesitatingly recommend that. And just to get a taste of what the Babylonian language is about. And there are other books like that, I think he's doing one about Sumerian, which is the other main languages. There are other introductory things to Sumerian. Of course, on the net nowadays, there are things like that. So if you just want to, as it were, like going to a funny restaurant and trying their soup and seeing whether you like the taste of the flavors and things, there are these books, especially Worthington's, where you can get quite a good idea. And the other thing is that if you, a person who likes languages and have a propensity for learning a bit of this and that, it's very rewarding because it's ancient and we have lots of literature and poetry and, as you say, Gilgamesh and all those things. And um, if you've done Arabic, Arabic yourself or Hebrew or one of those sorts of languages, then the Babylonian language is not at all strange. And when you begin to see, it's like it's an older sort of language of the modern sorts of language. So in a way, you can immerse yourself in it. So I think that you can do more now with a private reading on the bus or whatever it is, with a book of that kind than was ever possible before. Because in the old days, you had to go to university, write off 10 years of your life and subject yourself to arch misery in order to learn the stuff the hard way. So, I mean, I think if anybody does that or they poke around and they do get interested, then of course you can go to university and do a degree in these things. And sometimes I talk to kids who don't know what to do at university and they all do the same thing and their parents say, oh, you've got to do banking or I don't know, animation or publicity or all these kind of rubbish things. But if you go to university, you have an opportunity to do something completely interesting, which has nothing to do with the modern world, but just interesting. And that's a very good candidate because if you work hard for 3 years, you can then do work. And, we have 130,000 tablets in the British Museum. Lots of them need to be read by people. And there's a lot of work to be done. So it is, but it's the sort of thing, I think, Philip, you have to say it has a kind of health warning, because I think if you're naive and happy about life and find things interesting and everything's a miracle and want to know about everything and you step over the line into cuneiform studies, you may never be retrieved by your friends.
Yeah.
May never be the same again.
Have you ever heard of a guy called Alex Bellos? He's really a mathematician and written puzzle books. That was one I'd.
I know the sort of thing. Yeah.
Now, the reason why I mention this, he's got a whole chapter here on cuneiform, and
As a puzzle or cuneiform?
as a puzzle, and he sets cuneiform passages. He usually said were the following texts were discovered in the ruins of Persepolis and date from somewhere from the 6th and 4th centuries. Each is a carved figure above a doorway. And he puts out 2 texts of cuneiform. And he gets people to solve it and to translate it as a puzzle. And he shows them how to go about doing it, which I thought was a very intriguing way of doing that as a basic introduction to arouse people's curiosity.
I quite agree, yes.
Anyway, let me ask you another question about
just a moment. I just wanted to say I thought for a horrible moment you were going to show me the puzzle and expect me to do it on the spot. So let's change the subject immediately.
I have tried to do it myself, but having looked up from your table of cuneiform, I can't find the same cuneiform in his thing as you've got on.
I tell you why. Because if they're from Persepolis, they're probably in old Persian cuneiform, and their signs are made of wedges, but there's only an alphabet number of them. They're much simpler. Yeah.
Yes, they're much simpler.
They're much
simpler. And that makes it easier, I suppose.
Yes.
The question which has been asked by a number of people here is, has AI not been employed to scan your 130,000 tablets and just translate them all for you?
It hasn't yet, but it will be. We had an approach from an internet company once to see what they could do about it. And my answer was that if I can do it, then one of your computers can surely do it. And translation is perfectly realizable if you do the following things. If you have a system of a machine, you can teach them all the signs, and all the signs as they appear over 3,000 years, they're often quite different one to the other. They'd have to learn all the shapes and forms. Then they'd have to learn all the sound values of the signs, which is quite a lot. When you're a student, that's a kind of suicidal problem.
How can the sound values be obtained from something as old as that?
Well, originally, the way it worked is this, that the cuneiform writes basically in syllables.
Yeah.
And when they started cuneiform, it was very difficult. But then they discovered that sometimes the transcription, for example, of foreign names or words that they already knew about Mesopotamia from the Bible or from Greek, they recognized just by trial and error, and then they suddenly got this sign must be that, and then they got this sign must be. Once they got one or two, then they were off, and gradually, they pieced it. It was a very brilliant thing because lots of signs have many more than one phonetic value. That is a malicious and a horrible thing. But the thing is, if I can do it, a computer can do it. So we'd have to learn all that data, and then it would have to learn the vocabulary, and then the grammar, and then the syntax. So there are all these separate things that this poor machine would have to take in and have them all arrayed so that it could use them and bring them to bear on a sentence. So if you gave them a letter that said, "To my lord, speak as follows" in Assyrian, and a Belia kibi umma ata or something, so then the computer would look at the first one, Anna, the first sign, and it would go, and it would realize it had these possibles and look at the next one, and if it's that, it must be that. And so the computer would do very quickly what we do ourselves, and it would be perfectly possible if you had somebody who was a lunatic with endless money. And as a matter of fact, there are people in the world who are lunatics who have endless money. Let's not forget that. Somebody of that type could, if they wanted to and had nothing better to do, certainly bring in the resources of AI. And I'm sure that it's bound to happen because it's so quick and so beneficial if we can read all these things without the painstaking things we do already. But I don't think it's anybody's priority. But certainly the answer is, it's simple to me. If I can do it, I can sight read cuneiform. I know what the signs are. I know, and you know, I'm like a Babylonian. Not really, because I have trouble, but I'm supposed to be like an ancient Babylonian. But if I can do that, well, computer for sure can. So yes, it's a matter of priorities.
But it hasn't happened yet, but will happen, no doubt. Okay.
Yes, yes.
Last couple of questions then is, do you ever see yourself as a Mesopotamian, kind of out of sync with the present world, or out of time? I mean, do you ever imagine what it would be like if you personally lived in Mesopotamia? And do you think you'd get on in that society, or would you not get on in that society? What
I
would you?
think about it. I think about it often. The way I think about it is to try to be some kind of, so to speak, relationship with the scribes who write the tablets that I study. Because, I mean, for example, I'm writing this book about the technique of obtaining a dream to tell the future, a special kind of specialist activity. I found a lot of tablets to do with it, and they're all different. They're all in the late period, and it was a kind of changing matter. And the tablets are very remarkable. And if you read cuneiform as an exercise in grammar and translation and leave it at that, then it's a bit sterile. If you try and imagine how these things worked, what they sounded like, who employed them, what happens when they weren't successful, and all that, you kind of step into the room without sitting down at a chair. I think it's very constructive. I think if I'd have been there, I would have surely been a scribe. And a scholar, because the things that attract me are the same things. I mean, I would have been one of them for sure. I'm not be in the army killing the Elamites and things like that. It'd be horrible. So yes, I would hope so. And they have a kind of different side of things, which is esoterica and subtle meanings out of meanings and meanings under meanings, and my brain works in that way, so I find it not difficult to follow them, and I think I would be doing that. So I'd probably be the same kind of ineffectual, impoverished misfit that I am now in that environment with too many
Well,
children, sort of thing.
not so sure about that, but would you prefer to live in that society than this one?
um I think if one was living in the Babylon, um in a relatively comfortable kind of setup, not tilling the soil and everything, but and whatever, most normal people did. But if one was describing antiquity, I think it would be very agreeable, because one of the bugbears of being a modern lunatic who does this kind of thing is that most tablets are broken, and you have to find the bits that join, and sometimes we don't find the bits that join, and it's an ongoing difficulty that big swathes of complete text are quite rare. Whereas in antiquity, nothing was broken. Or if it was, they wrote it out again. So the library will be full of complete manuscripts, and that would be the most staggering luxury, because no archaeologist will ever see such a thing. Yes.
Okay. What would you miss about this society most?
Electric guitar.
Electric guitar. I didn't know you played electric guitar. That's interesting.
And I like them as well. Yes.
Oh, good. Last question, then, if we may, and that is, again, it's a more personal one, but have you personally learned any wisdom from the Mesopotamians? You're bridging millennia here. You're getting into the mind of a different civilization, a different people. I just wonder if you've personally learned any wisdom from the Mesopotamians which you could pass on.
Well, one thing I think is a kind of wisdom, that the scribes in Mesopotamia were trained to protect literature and scholarship and documents, to copy them carefully, not to muck around with them or change them, and do all they could to keep the corpus of traditional knowledge safe on clay, and against all odds. And to a large extent, they succeeded because of the discoveries that have been made. Of course, there'll always be more of them. So the idea that inscriptions from the past, because they venerated things the older they were for their own reasons, but the idea that things from the past were very important and writings from the past should be rescued is something which I believe in very strongly. And there is a way in which it had a very direct effect on me, because of I invented this idea of rescuing diaries in Britain, started a thing called the Great Diary Project, where we give a home to diaries in families that people don't want to get rid of, they don't want to throw them away. They go to this collection. So we have about 18,000 manuscript diaries since it started, and they're about the same size as cuneiform tablets. And if you have one diary from 1927, for example, you can look at it. Oh, it's not very interesting. But if you read it and you take the diary and you squeeze it like this to get all the information out of it, it's amazing sometimes what comes out, even for one. And it's the same with the clay tablet. If you have a clay tablet and it's broken, I can't read it. But then you determined to get every bit of knowledge out of it. Same kind of principle. And one tablet and one diary tell you something. But if you have a whole run of diaries or a whole run of tablets in a series, it tells you much more. So there's a kind of parallel between them. And I'm not sure that I would have ever got so involved in that rescue campaign, which has been very successful. It goes from strength to strength. It's in the Bishopsgate Institute.
I saw that you were giving a talk about that in the Conway Hall when I passed by a few weeks back.
Yes, you should have come in. We could have had a cup of tea.
I wasn't around on that particular day. I saw the advertised.
Yes.
I would have come in otherwise.
It's very important, because people on the whole don't respect things from before, and when they're written in handwriting and they're inky and they've got spiders in and dust, that people throw them away. They've forgotten it's all over, but it's not all over. And of course, the humanity that comes out of diaries is identical to the humanity you get out of tablets. So in a way, they seem to me to run hand in glove. And I think in the middle of the biggest cuneiform library which we have, which is in the British Museum, and it's in a very august 3-floor library with books and journals and the tablets all the way around, it's it has an effect on you. And I think probably that if that is the kind of wisdom that the writings from contemporary and from the past should be saved for the future, definitely that. Yes, definitely.
Okay. Dr. Irving Finkel, thank you ever so much indeed for your time today and for another fascinating conversation. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.